if I'm saying that correctly, but he's having surgery.
He's got a hernia.
He got a fucking hernia. That's right. So he's out. Whitesnake is out. That is huge. That leaves a massive hole in that tour. And Sammy's going to need a middle headliner there. So the funny thing is Eddie was a bit of a wise guy. Eddie was very good in this interview, and he said, tell you what, why don't you call Roth? Which I thought was a good idea, because David Lee Roth, number one, is out there, okay, but I think he's actually double booked. We'll get into that later because he added some extra dates with Kiss. Who knows if any of these goddamn tours are going to happen? Most likely not. They're all going to be pushed to next year. But the tour is supposed to go from July through September, and Sam at this time was saying, hey, listen, we'll have to take the first part and move it to the end, and I don't know, we'll go August, September, October if we can, and he's talking about possibly jostling things around if they can rebook the first third of the tour. They don't have someone to replace Whitesnake right now. When he heard Eddie's suggestion of Dave, Sammy suggested to Eddie, goes, why don't you give him a call? And Eddie's like, I don't even know the guy. And then Mike said, come on, Eddie, we'll give you a piece of the action, which I thought was funny. So now this is where it got really funny. They mentioned something about like, oh, I hear you're already part of that tour, Michael Anthony. And Sammy was like, yeah, I heard the background vocals were the best part of Dave's show, which is, ooh, it's a little shot jab to the side.
Yeah.
And Michael Anthony said, I knew that kind of sounded familiar to me. So true. So true. It's true. And then Sammy said, hey, at least he's out there trying to get something going. And he said, hey, maybe he's the guy. And I think it's so funny that Sammy calls him Diamond. I love that. He's like, it reminds me of when Apollo Creed used to call Rocky Stallion. I thought that was kind of funny. He has that sort of like, you know, that boxer mentality. You know, Sammy likes to box, but he kind of talks trash and this and that. I thought that's kind of funny. But then he got into the Sam and Dave tour a little bit. He says, let me tell you something about the Sam and Dave tour from 2002. He says, that was a very successful tour financially. He says it just got ugly and Dave wasn't really user-friendly. And then, you know, obviously Eddie said, hey, listen, to Michael Anthony, have you heard anything from the Van Halen camp? What's going on? He said, it's crickets over there, Eddie. They're in their own bubble. Asked him if he heard any of the Wolfie clips on the internet from Wolfie's solo album that he's been teasing. And Sammy said, you know what? I heard his stuff on the internet and it sounds fucking good. He goes, it could really be a good record. You know, then he got back to Van Halen and he said to Michael Anthony, he says, you know, what's going on? Like, I don't understand. What is with the secrecy with the brothers? And he says, they never wanted to do anything with the fans. He says, they always wanted to be a mysterious band like Led Zeppelin. Everything they do, they would ask, what would Zeppelin do? And they never wanted to document anything like a live album or a live tour. But he said, and this is a quote from Michael Anthony, the tapes are out there, somebody has it. Like, he's saying that people have the tapes, the reels, the recordings, soundboard of the makings of a Van Halen live album, and you know, it's all a matter of red tape of getting it out there. Now, the funny thing is, Sammy came in and he was talking about the Van Halen bootlegs. He goes, you know what? I dig the old quality of the bootlegs. He said it's very rock and roll. And they started talking about bootlegs. And that was kind of an interesting exchange. But the most interesting exchange, and boy, this actually fit perfectly in with this episode. So he talked about the Ted Templeman book, which is Ted Templeman, A Platinum Producer's Life and Music by Greg Renoff and Ted Templeman. That is the focus of our episode here. We're going to be doing a whole episode here focused on that book where we interview Greg and Dave and I do a deep dive on the whole book, all the Van Halen parts, of course. He spoke to Ted about the book. Sammy spoke to Ted about the book, and Ted said, I should have proofread it more. Now it's done, and I cringe a little bit. Now, that's nothing against Greg. He's not talking about Greg's writing. Greg actually is a very good writer. He did a great job. But I think he's a little concerned about, like, what he said in the book. When asked about Ted, Sammy Hagar said he's more private than Ed and Al put together. He says that's a recluse right there. What did you make of that comment, Dave?
I was surprised because there really wasn't any dirt in Ted's book.
I don't think there's dirt in Ted's book. Dirt is like real grungy shit. But what Ted did do was be very honest about the situation. Everything in Ted's book about Van Halen is about the recordings. So obviously Ted is the producer. He's not going to talk about crazy shit on the road and, little in-between things with Ed and Dave. He's talking about what happened in relation to the recording. Now, there is a lot of meat on that bone. I'll tell you that much. If you're interested in that stuff, and as we are, we have plenty to talk about because this episode is packed full of that stuff. Our discussion is lengthy. Our interview with Greg is lengthy, and there's a lot of enriched stuff. So there is, I wouldn't call that stuff dirt. It's just straightforward what was going on behind the scenes, though, and that's definitely revealing, no?
Yeah, it is, but I don't know, maybe because Ted's such a private guy, even when he did tell, he's like, I don't know if I should have spoken about that.
Yeah, exactly.
But Sammy's the wrong guy to have that conversation with.
For sure.
Because, Sam let it all hang out.
Oh, boy, yeah.
But anyway, it's an interesting conversation they had.
Then Eddie brought up about Sammy being talked about as Dave's replacement back in 77 in the book, and we'll get all into this later on in the episode, where Ted talks about Dave as, I don't know if this guy's going to cut it on vocals, and he's thinking about Sam because he had just worked with him in Montrose, and Sammy was out of Montrose at that time. Sammy says that is so crazy, and Michael Anthony says, I remember him talking to Ed and Al and me about it. And the interesting thing is, in the book, he doesn't really say he talked to the band. He said he talked to Don Landy, right, Dave?
Yeah, I was surprised to hear Mike say that.
Yeah.
Because I thought he had pretty much kept it to himself, and he never told anybody about it. And he was glad he didn't because it would have been a huge mistake if he had dropped out Dave. And he certainly never told Sam. Sam had no idea about that until years later.
Absolutely. That's funny. This is another interesting point that came up in Eddie's conversation. They were talking about how Sam fell into Van Halen, and we go into deep discussions about this. So Sammy said, I had just finished my VOA record, and I came home from the tour, and I was writing for the next record. Now, we're about 3 or 4 months into 1985 at this point. Dave has already released Crazy from the Heat. It's already a hit. He's got singles, California Girls Just a Gigolo, or around maybe even later, into the summer, early summer, late spring of 1985. And he says here, I finished the VOA record, came home from the tour, and was writing for the next record. This is a quote from Sam. We're talking every day, meaning him and Ted. I was looking to take my time and take a big break, and Ted calls me and says Dave left the band. And I looked at my wife and I said, they're going to call me. When he says his wife, he means Betsy, his first wife. And he says, I told Ted that, and within 2 days, Ed called me. The whole time I worked with Ted, he never said that to me about joining the band, meaning back in 77. So when he's saying he worked with Ted all through the VOA album, he never even mentioned, hey, by the way, I was considering you for replacing Roth and Van Halen. So that was always a shock to him.
And that's interesting because I seem to remember that when he tells the story about when he met Ed at the auto place.
He didn't meet him there. What happened was...
Oh, no, you're right. I'm sorry. You're right. I apologize.
Number. Yeah.
Right. But he had spoken to the guy.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy had told him that he had spoken to Ed.
Right.
So he knew his name had gotten thrown around and that he had told his wife.
Right. They're going to call me.
Those guys are going to call me.
Yeah, right.
So my question to Sam is, so you said that to your wife twice?
Right.
Or you're not quite sure when you heard it? Did Ted Templeman tell you?
No, he said. Oh, wait a second.
Or did Claudio, the auto guy?
Well, this is my whole point, and we get into this in our discussion, and we get into it with Greg. This is where I think there's some funny memories going on because Sammy says straight out that Ted told him. Now, Ted didn't tell him, oh, by the way, David Lee Roth, Van Halen, you might want to give Ed a call. He didn't say that. He said it in passing. And Greg, we'll talk about it later, but Greg, backs that up. It wasn't like, he was, here's an opportunity. But at the same time, Sam is pretty sharp. And I get into this whole thing. I don't really believe the whole Claudio story anymore. I think that's all made up. And I think it's a PR cover-up. We'll get into that later. But anyway, so also part of this interview, I know. Also part of this interview, what they were talking about, because Eddie had read the Ted Templeman book. So this was important to talk about. He was talking about when Eddie Van Halen opened up 5150 back in, I guess, 83, his own studio. And Michael Anthony said Ed built his sanctuary, but he goes, we wouldn't see Don and Ed for weeks at a time. Who knows what was going on? And then he said, well, we kind of know what was going on. What did you make of that, Dave?
I don't know. Maybe he means he saw the writing on the wall.
I don't know.
Like he knew, like I think, some people were smart enough to see what was going on.
Right,
that this was Ed making a power play.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
Right? Yeah. I mean, I think that's pretty much what he was saying.
Right. And then he kind of Sammy went into the whole 1984 thing. Now, he says, when I heard Jump on the radio, these guys had a real pop hit, and they were not a pop band. It was so rare for a rowdy rock band like Van Halen to have a pop hit like that. He says, we all wanted a pop hit without copping out, and Jump was brilliant. Now, I would imagine when I heard this quote, I said, Dave's blood is going to boil over this. And I was like, because Sammy was always against Jump. And if you actually technically look at it, Sammy didn't embrace singing Jump until the third tour. Now, granted, he played Jump at a few shows on the 5150 tour in 1986, but he used to bring a guy on stage to sing with him. We'll get into that later in the news where he talks about that, but now he's praising Jump as being brilliant, and he didn't embrace it until the 1991, 92 For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge tour, where they used to play it back-to-back with Top of the World, which was always a great pairing, because the intro riff to Top of the World is the outro riff to Jump, so I thought that was brilliant. But what did you make of this comment, Dave?
Oh, please, Sam is rewriting history. He's like, oh, yeah, it was a great pop song, and that's why I would sing it. It was like, Sam, like, you totally resisted singing it, like you resisted most of the Dave era catalog.
I know.
He would always drag somebody up on stage to sing it with him, which so much so ticked off the rest of the band that they told him, either stop doing that or don't sing it. So he chose not to sing it.
Right.
So they stopped doing it on the 5150 tour. They didn't do it on the OU812 tour.
Nope.
I mean, so when he's kind of like, oh, yeah, it was a great pop song, so I sang it. No, you didn't, Sam. Not for years.
I know.
So, again, it's Sam's half-ass memory rewriting things.
Always.
That better suit him. He should work for the White House, this guy.
That'd be perfect. So now the funny thing is, Eddie got into Jump. Now, Eddie has a big problem with Jump. He didn't like Jump. He feels like it killed the band, this whole thing, whatever. So Michael... Yeah,
he really does not like that song.
He goes hard. I mean, Eddie goes hard. He talks about Eddie's perspective, and he's entitled to it, whatever. He says the first 4 Van Halen albums, Van Halen 1, 2, Women and Children First, and Fair Warning, are perfect. He says they're perfect. Then he says things started to break down with Diver Down and then fully broke down in 1984. I do not know how anybody who is a Van Halen fan could say that. I really, really don't. I mean, the sales between Diver Down and 1984 combined is something over 16 million. I mean, you got to be kidding me with that. I don't want to hear that shit. That's absolute bullshit. But whatever. That's his perspective.
He's entitled to his opinion, but yeah, I'm always surprised when he treats like 1984.
Right. The end of the world.
Yeah, it was okay.
Yeah, the end of the world. Let's go back to 1984, because Dave and I were there, okay? Jump, it's not like it was so shocking. It was 1984. Yes, was it poppy? Abso-fucking-lutely. But everything was sort of meshed together. We've talked about this before. The charts were a mix of like Bruce Springsteen with Cyndi Lauper, with Michael Jackson, with Huey Lewis, with Van Halen. Like everything was sort of like all together. Whereas today's world, you got rock over here, you got heavy metal over there, you got rap over there, you got pop over there. I mean, it wasn't as much of a salad as it was back in '84, where everything was sort of